like to welcome everybody to this video presentation. I have a friend of mine that I've known for quite some number of years, Ray Dunn. And Ray has got some remarkable stories about his service in World War II. I don't know if you are familiar with the fact that almost all World War II veterans are now 85 plus or minus a few years old, and they're passing away at the rate of 1,000 a day. And there won't be very many years until there won't be any of these people left. And the reason for this presentation is to encourage you video makers among us to do the same thing with somebody you might know who has these kind of memories. Ray, would you tell us a little bit about when you joined? What were the circumstances?
I was actually drafted.
Oh my.
I was one of the 18 million. And at the time I was drafted, I took some real hard type lessons from my basic training, which occurred in St. Louis at Jefferson Barracks. And had some, after that I had some specialized training in Chicago. I was then transferred to Hill Air Force Base for a while. And while I was there, I decided I'd like to get out of the Air Material Command, which was the command at that time.
I'll bet you felt lucky to be in the Army Air Force instead of the Army.
I surely was, after I'd seen some of those movies of the GIs fighting in Europe and also in the Pacific. But anyway, the group that I belonged to at Hill was disbanded by the Inspector General for some reason, and I was shipped to Fresno, California, to Hammer Field. And at that time, Hammer Field was training their pilots with an aircraft called the P-70, which was actually the night fighter version of the A-20. The A-20 was a two-engine airplane built by Douglas, and it was known as the Havoc. But as I was there at Fresno, I got a notice to get back to Nashville, Tennessee, and meet with General George.
It's good to have friends in high places, isn't it?
Yes, surely was. When I got back there, I was just a pile of wonderment. What's going on, you know? And they didn't tell me, other than they give me a good physical. And with that, they put me on an Eastern Airlines DC-3 and shipped me down to Homestead, Florida. And when I arrived at Florida, there was the most amazing sight that I had experienced. All I saw was a whole group of C-46s. And as you know, the C-46 at that time was the largest two-engine aircraft built by the Army and built by the Army Air Force. And I was amazed by the size of it, and I think most people that see one of those never realized how big of an airplane it was. It had a 108-foot wingspan. It was powered by two R-2800 engines, and of course they were radial type, air-cooled, and those engines developed about 2,000 horsepower each.
The designation R means radial, and 2,800 is the amount of cubic inches in the engine.
Right, yeah.
It's two rows of 18 cylinders each.
Yeah. And with that, they started training me on the C-46 because Homestead was the second OTU, Overseas Training Unit. But while I was training there, I was sent up to Buffalo, New York, to the Curtis factory to wait and pick up a brand new C-46. And there I took further training. And I ended up as a non-com, is what I was. But when I was assigned to the group itself, which was known as the 2nd ATS, Air Transport Squadron, I found that we were actually not part of the Air Transport Command, which was using a lot of C-46s. And it was brought on board during the war. And we that flew it did all the R&D work on it, working out all the problems. And it was known as a hydraulic nightmare. Now, you was asking about why the fat. Actually, the airplane was designed to be the first pressurized commercial airliner. It was called the CW-20, Curtiss-Wright 20. And to pressurize the fuselage, they just put two circular sections together. And of course, the lower circle section is used for storage and such, and the upper part was for passengers. But they actually built about 3,000 of them for the Air Corps. Our group was actually a mobile air base, and it was known as a Moby Dick outfit. And every one of us in the group were available for flight, and it was a real fun group to belong to, because we felt that we were the best in the world, and got a lot of enjoyment on feeling that way too. But to get to China, we took a long route that I'd like to show you on this map here. We actually started out here at Homestead, Florida, and we took off about 3 o'clock in the morning, all 20 of our aircraft. However, we didn't fly in formation, we just flew single. Now, our next stop was Burincum Field in Puerto Rico. And from Puerto Rico, the next day, we flew to Atkinson Field in British Guiana. We stayed there overnight, and the next day we flew to Belém, Brazil, which is right on the Amazon River. Then from there up to the most far eastern portion of South America, a place named Natal. You've probably heard of that. Now come the adventure of flying the South Atlantic. And from Natal, we flew to the Ascension Islands. Now, the Ascension Islands was only about 5 miles long and about 2 miles wide. And it was just kind of a peak of a mountain sticking up. So to build the runway, they actually carved across that little rock. And they were able to build a runway about 5,000 feet long. So when you landed or took off from it, it was like landing or taking off on an aircraft carrier. Now, from the Ascensions, we then flew over to Accra in Africa. And this area in Africa was known as the Ivory Coast at that time. From Accra, we wanted to fly to Khartoum in the Egyptian Sudan, but as we got over Nigeria, we run into a dust storm, and the dust storm seemed to rise clear up to 50,000 feet. Made a 180-degree turn back and landed at a place called Kano. Followed us into Kano. The following morning, we got in our airplane and taxied down to the end of the runway and took off. Now, as we were gaining speed along the runway, all of a sudden, in a very short distance, we were in the air. And all of a sudden, in a few hundred feet while we were back down on the ground. And we made a real hard landing on the three-point suspension of a C-46. Of course, you know that's a tail dragger type aircraft. With that, why, I had opened the side windows on it, which were actually escape hatches. And I looked out and I could see down the wing at the ground. And I could also see that things inside, which was our equipment as such that we were flying for our own use in our own airplanes, I could see it all coming loose in the fuselage of the airplane. And stuff was flying around, heavy crates and tie-down irons and all kinds of stuff flying around. But at the same time that we were having this problem, our other two aircrafts were trying to get across the runway from where they had been parked. They wanted to get across the runway so that they could come up to the end and take off. Now, as we were having our problems keeping in the air, the first plane was parked on the side of the runway, and he saw us coming and he moved it across the runway. And when we hit the ground again, we hit exactly where he had been parked. We then bounced high again, and we went through a Nigerian cornfield. And those cornfields had deep furrows between the rows of corn, which were about 2.5 feet deep and about 3 feet wide. And we went crosswise across those. And all the time it sounded like 10,000 bugles blowing and everything else of noise it was making. But anyway, we finally come to a stop, and we had crashed. The whole right-hand side of the airplane was ruined, and the landing gear was caved in. And as I looked down at one of the wheels, there were large bubbles of rubber, and they were burning, and this started our aircraft on fire. So I jumped out of that escape hatch on the side and got away from there. That night, the commanding officer of the air base there at Kano met with us, and of course we had been inspected by the dispensary too for injury, but he told us we were the luckiest guys he'd ever seen. Now, a while later, one of our own airplanes, which had landed at a town called Maiduguri over on the eastern border of Nigeria, he come back to pick us up. And when he gets over the field, his gear won't come down. He's got troubles. But anyway, after flying around for a while, he was able to get it down. He then picked us up and flew us back to Maiduguri.
And then, you said that you class 26 that, and how much did it cost?
$326,000. Class 26 is when you put it in the junkyard and signed to get it off the inventory, is what it is. Now, from Maiduguri we went into Khartoum, and you've always all heard the story about what is it, guns to the left of me, guns to the right of me. That occurred at Khartoum. Now, another interesting thing about that area is that's where the White Nile and the Blue Nile meet together. And from then on, it's a single river up to the Mediterranean. Now, we left Khartoum and turned north and flew all the way up the Nile River to Cairo. And that's when we decided to take a little scenic trip and look at the pyramids. And that's the first time that I knew that there are 6 pyramids, the 3 large ones and 3 small ones. From the area around Cairo, that we then turned east and flew to a base called Devaswa on the Suez Canal. Now, the Devaswa actually is a French name, and you know it was the French and the English that built the Suez years and years before. At Devaswa, we had an adventure there. I did. While I was out on flight, why, the little barracks that I was in, which was much like our old CC barracks, a single-story long building, it burned. And everything I owned was burned. My weapons and all my clothing, and all I had on was what I was wearing that day. Well, we stayed there in Devaswa for about a month or 5 weeks, and the mission we accomplished then was to fly back to Oran or Casablanca and pick up engines for the B-29s. When B-29s were first introduced, they used an engine called the 3350, which developed about 2,600 horsepower. And they were bad engines. They had problems with the engines heating up and starting on fire. And they lost a number of aircraft because of that reason. But anyway, they needed engines in India for their B-29s that had just arrived there. So our job was to pick the engines up and fly them clear over to Karachi, India. And we would unload them there at Karachi and then deadhead back to Devaswa. And generally the airplanes needed a 50-hour inspection after each flight we made. It took that long. Now from Karachi, we then flew to a base called Kalakunda, which was near the headquarters base of the 20th Air Force, which had the B-29s in India. The base there for the 20th Air Force is named Karagapur. Now we then become the support group for the B-29s, and our big load was generally a load of gasoline. And the gasoline was contained in 55-gallon drums, and usually on every flight we'd carry about 25 to 27 drums of fuel. And the fuel was special for B-29s. It was 130 octane, kind of an aromatic fuel, which smelled good when you'd get the exhaust. Now, while I was there in Kalakunda, the first day we arrived, we set up a tent city, kind of on a slope and a hill, and we had problems right now because it was the monsoon season, and we no sooner got set up and it started to rain. And our weatherman indicated to me and some of the other fellows, that it had rained over 22 inches in 24 hours. And because of that, it flooded and it washed us all down the little slope in the hill. Then the big problem that we had was all of the snakes that come out of the ground because of the flooding. And we were chasing deadly poisonous crete snakes there for days and days after that. That's another one of the adventures of trying to get overseas to India.
Without bad luck, you wouldn't have had any luck at all.
In the meantime, we're still making our missions for the B-29 group. After we'd been in this base, which was fairly near Calcutta, by the way, I had a 3-day pass in Calcutta while I was at Kalakunda, and I didn't see any of that glamour that they promoted all the time about India, you know. To me, you could smell Calcutta 50 miles away. And I felt so bad for the absolute poverty and destitution I saw with the natives there. Also, I was amazed by the sacred cows, too. But our job then at Calcutta was to to fly fuel up to the north in what we call the Assam Valley, which was a real heavy jungle area.
Before we get to this, tell them about the meat you ate.
Oh, yeah. Well, the main meat meal, both in India and China, was water buffalo. And of course, when you looked at it, it kind of looked like the sole of your shoes. And when you ate it, it was like the sole of your shoes. And of course, in India, most of our food was dehydrated, everything. And even what bothered me, I couldn't even get a good piece of chocolate. It was dehydrated too. And you'd go to melt it down to make it edible, and it would fry much like butter.
The Boeing B-29 Superfortress was built primarily for the Japanese theater of operations. It entered the service in early 1944, and the first raids were staged on the 5th of June 1944 out of India. 10 days later, they were able to start striking targets in Japan. They would fly the airplanes from India up into the forward bases in China, top it off with fuel, and then stage the raids from China up to 3,000 miles to Japan and back to China, where they'd recover. These bombing raids contributed in a decisive manner to the destruction of the Japanese industrial machine and the sapping of the civilian population's morale. As the Pacific War advanced, they were able to move the ships from India to the Marshall Islands and increase the number of bomb runs each day and put a lot more pressure on the Japanese war machine.
The route that we took to get the fuel to the B-29s start here at Calcutta, at Dakundi and at Calakunda, and we flew this, what we call the A route, up to an area called Shangtu in western China. Now, the A route was the one where you had to fly at least 23,000 feet to get over the mountains. This was the easy route here, which was the southern end of the Himalayan mountains, and they only had to fly at 16,000 feet to get over the hump there. Of course, the mountains were known as the Hump. Now, the Shangtu is where the B-29s went from the Calcutta area, and that's where they refueled and where they were their bomb loads were put on. And then from there they made their missions into the eastern coast of China and also over Japan. The first raid that was made, by the way, was in Yawata, which was up toward Mongolia actually, but all the rest of the raids were over Japan. The airplanes had problems with the engines, and actually the whole purpose of our outfit was that in case of one having to make a forced landing in China proper or maybe Tibet, we could fly an airplane up and take care of his problems, because two of our airplanes were equipped with shops in them. One, you could do machine work and propeller work, and the other, you could do work on such things as automatic pilots and instruments and hydraulic systems like that. Now, people say, well, you must have had a kind of a rough flying. Actually, it was the worst flying in the world. It was the worst weather in the world, because it was in these areas up in here, up in the Himalayas, where the monsoons originated. And you would get winds, tail winds of 150 miles an hour, or headwinds, and it made pretty rough flying. A real interesting experience was with one of my fellow crewmen that was in a C-46 in rough air, and the air turned him over and he fell about 1,500 feet upside down. And when he come out of it, he was able to fly to the base, and we had to make it class 26 because the tail assembly of his airplane was completely turned. And we had a lot of experiences that way. Now, one of the jobs that we had to perform was to evacuate some of the air bases that General Chennault had built along the eastern coast of China, because the Japanese had come down from Mongolia and taken over the railroad, which run right through China, from Peking to Hankow to Canton. And when they went down through China, they then spread out about 200 miles on each side of the railroad. And of course, they would take it over, and pretty soon we had to evacuate these bases that were on the East Coast, and we then destroyed them with burned earth facility. We even buried 500-pound bombs out in the runway, blew the runway all to pieces. Now that's one of the real exciting adventures that I had, because on one flight back to our home base there at Luliang in China, my airplane had trouble with one of the engines, the number one engine on the left-hand side. It blew a number one cylinder, and I think you know what happens when they blow. Number one cylinder is actually the master rod for a round engine, and when it blew that cylinder, the cylinder went right through the cowling, and it started on fire. But luckily, we were able to put the fire out with the fire extinguisher system that's mounted in the airplane itself. Sylvester's Circus was named after the commanding officer of the squadron. His name was Frank Sylvester, and he was from California, and he had a wonderful personality, and he was really a soldier's friend. He was the pilot that we looked up to, and he had a wonderful way of getting along with all the men in the outfit. Now, you could tell Sylvester Circus by the yellow nose that it had. It was known as the Yellow Nose Squadron, and we had an extra large diamond painted on the nose, whereas the members of the Air Transport Command, the ATC, all of their airplanes had a real small diamond on the nose. So by the size of that diamond, you could tell whether the airplane belonged to the 20th Air Force or whether it belonged to the ATC. And we set quite a few records in the theater too, as Sylvester Circus.
Used to say join the Navy and see the world. It looks like you did pretty well in the Army Air Force. Tell us a little bit about what China was different in China than India. Well,
like I've expressed before, I had a problem liking India because of the real poverty I saw there, and of course the time I was there, why Mahatma Gandhi was the leader of India at that time, and there was a lot of religious strife between different persons, and I didn't care for the food that we had there, but as we as we went into China, I kind of liked China because it reminded me more of being home. The weather where I was at Luliang, China, was more like the weather in St. George. And the reason that I liked it is that they were able to grow grapefruit and peaches and plums and a lot of vegetables, and that's what the GIs liked. In fact, most of them would try to get a special flight over the hump to get good fresh food, and especially eggs. And the little Chinese people would call them egguses, so we'd go in begging for a dozen egguses just to get them back to India, because you never saw anything like that at India.
Now, after the Pacific War went along a ways, and they started capturing islands like the Marshall Islands, they moved the B-29s into the Pacific because they didn't have to fly the hump to get fuel. They could get fuel from the ocean, and your mission changed.
Well, the mission changed in the fact that that Chiang Kai-shek was having problems with mayo over there. My particular outfit got the job of, or the responsibility of trying to move 30,000 Chinese American trained troops out of northern Burma and move them up to a town known as Peking at that time. That town now is Beijing. And those 30,000 troops, of course, would be used to slow Mao down. So that all happened about the end of the war. Guard on the runway, guarding the runway and preventing the peasants from running across while airplanes were landing and taking off. The Chinese had no fear of the airplanes. In fact, they would run out in front of them sometimes. Groups at the mud pit mixing straw and mud together to be laid into the runway. Now, the runways were really interesting. They were built in about 3 different layers. Little children or little peasants about 4 years old broke up rocks and about the size of gravel. And then the older folks broke up rocks that were long and cylindrical and probably a foot or 14 inches long. And they were vertically installed over the gravel. And then mud was inserted in the cylindrical rocks, which made a runway probably about 18 inches thick. And that mud was used to glue everything together, and here we see the peasants tamping down the mud as it's been poured into the runway.
How come they didn't just use machinery?
Machinery wasn't available. We couldn't get anything that size over the hump on our aircraft, so everything was hewn by hand and all done by human power too.
How many of these dudes worked on it?
Usually about 20,000 folks were there, including the little ones and the older ones. It was quite a sight to see them working. One of the ancient carts they used to haul materials around in, probably 3,000 years behind our time. Wooden wheels, and sometimes a beast of burden, the water buffalo would haul it, but generally human power.
I've heard the term the aluminum trail, the flight path up over the Himalayas. What were they talking about there?
Well, they were talking about one of the routes that we took across the hump, and there were something like 550 aircraft went down in that area as they crossed the hump, and we called it the aluminum trail. And actually, on a good day, you didn't have to navigate or listen to your radio compass or anything. You could actually keep your eye on the hump down below and follow it across by looking for the crashes. They would actually shine up, the aluminum such of them.
So you lost thousands of people during that time across that route.
Well, yes, the average crew size, of course, the flying crews was 4. Pilot, co-pilot, radio operator, and crew chief.
Now, one of the things that I was aware of is that in the early part of the hump, they did good to get 3,000 tons of military hardware and gasoline across there in a month.
Yeah, right.
What happened to that?
Well, it increased after the commanding general, General Tunner, told us that we were going to fly come heck nor high water, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Before that, we'd kind of take it easy on a real stormy day that we knew there was bad weather over the hump. So we flew all the time, and within the first month, we increased our tonnage up to 10,000 tons. As our safety improved, by the month of July, we hauled a total of 71,042 tons over the hump. On the day that we decided to celebrate Army Air Force Day, August the 1st, we had 1,118 round trips, and we hauled 5,327 tons in one day. That averaged 2 trips per available plane. One plane crossed the hump every minute and 12 seconds. In fact, 4 times a minute, a ton of material was landed in China. Well, it was interesting with all the stuff we took over the hump. I would say that half of it was at that time gasoline for the B-29s. And of course people figured and wanted to know what we did on the way back. Did we come back empty? No, we didn't. The big load that we would bring back was pig's bristle, believe it or not. China raises pigs and comes up with the biggest market of pig bristles in the world, and they were really needed during World War II. What for, I don't know, other than brushes maybe. And also, we brought tungsten back from China. So you look at one of our airplanes over there, a C-46 especially, and you're liable to see all kinds of stuff inside of them. And then, generally a C-46 in carrying American GIs, maybe we could get 30 of them in an airplane. But when we moved the Chinese would try their best to get over 60 in the airplane. In fact, there's some real interesting things happened. They would count maybe 50 Chinese in their airplane on takeoff, on landing, and when they got landed over on the other side, why, maybe there was 4 or 5 of them missing. They had actually opened the door up and jumped out. In fact, we even hear one story where the group of Chinese soldiers built a fire inside the airplane to warm up, because we were flying over at 24,000 feet, which was 50 degrees below zero. They actually built a fire in the airplane to keep warm. And, so we saw all kinds of strange things go on.
One of the things that surprised me is you flew mostly at night because the weather was better, and then there were no Japanese Zeros up there trying to shoot you down.
Right. from the very beginning, the Japanese had come down from Mongolia and had completely made every port impossible for shipping, closed them off. And they went clear over to Burma, and then they went up into Burma to Mandalay. You've heard about that. And then clear up into northern Burma to a place called Myitkyina. And there they built a large air base where they had 250 fighter planes. And those fighter planes would go after our airplanes while we were flying the Hump.
Tell us what they did when they'd shoot them down.
Well, we had a situation where one of our crews was flying in eastern China and was attacked by a Zero fighter. And in fact, the pilot was a very good friend of mine. The pilot happened to be the co-pilot on the C-46 that I was on when we crashed in Nigeria. But anyway, his co-pilot bailed out and his chute opened up, and as he was going down, the Zero fighter killed him shot him and killed him while he was coming down. So you had heard stories of that, but that actually happened in our outfit.
Pretty sad tale.
Yeah. Well, we don't say much and don't want to hear much about some of the atrocities that occurred in those days, but it was amazing. Probably if you've seen any pictures of 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, or maybe John Wayne and the Flying Tigers, you saw a flyer or a pilot with a flag like this on the back of his A2 jacket. This is called a blood chit. And basically what it says in Chinese is that I am an American flyer. And I'm your friend, and I would like to be shown the way back to my home base. And the Chinese would read that, and I had friends that crashed in eastern China and took them as long as 6 months to get back to friendly territory. But this is a little note that you wore on the back of your jacket. And later, we had to put them on the inside because we found out they made pretty good targets. But actually we carried this, and you want to hold that? And a map of the Asiatic, one of the portions of the Asiatic theater. That's made of silk. And that's an air map there. And we carried this map and that blood chit, plus another type of chit that has about a dozen different languages written on it. And we carried them in a money belt, just in case we needed, in case we bailed out or crashed. These are very rare, and you'll never find them again.
Now, I'd like to ask you what happened when you heard about the Enola Gay dropping the atomic bomb. You didn't know it was going to happen, obviously.
Oh, no. It was the most amazing day, I thought. I had just come in from a flight, and it was a cold, dank day, and I was kind of down in the dumps anyway, because I was getting kind of lonesome for my dear wife that I had been away from for some time. And I don't think my morale was very good. But anyway, I went into operation, and on the bulletin board was a little note saying that Japan had been bombed, and that we had dropped a bomb on them that had the power of 10,000 tons of TNT. And of course, that was the first bomb on Hiroshima. And boy, my morale really boosted up then. I could see a chance we were going to get home someday. Yeah, you know, our motto over there is, we'll win this darn war in spite of the Chinese. When they come up to the priorities of shipping bits and pieces and weapons and all that was needed by the armies, why, we got the last priority. And took us a long time to really to get the strength to really go after the Japanese. But that's where it got its name, was the fact that we felt that we had been forgotten by both politics and the public.
I thought one of the interesting things you told me was about your brother. Why don't you relate that?
My younger brother, maybe you know him, his name is Bill Dunn. He, at one time, he was the aviation editor of the Deseret News. He was a B-25 pilot. He flew the B-25 that had the 14 50 caliber guns facing forward, plus a 75 millimeter cannon in the nose. Maybe you've heard of it.
And they'd strafe all the supply lines.
Right, and it was his outfit that developed bounce bombing, where they would actually fly up to a bridge right on the river, near the river, and drop the bomb so it could bounce and hit the bridge. But he was stationed at a place called Feni, right on the Burmese border, the border of India and Burma. And he was probably only about 100 miles away from me, and I never knew it. And he didn't know where I was either, because we absolutely couldn't tell anybody where we were.
When they dropped the atomic bomb and they surrendered, you went home the next day.
Well, this base in China called Luliang, I was one of the high point men there, and I left Luliang on the 3rd of October and flew down in a C-54 down to a base called Kanchapara in near Calcutta. And at Calcutta, I stayed there in Calcutta until the day after Thanksgiving. Now imagine I'd arrived there on the 3rd of October. And the day after Thanksgiving, we were put on a ship. And finally, after going through the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea and the Mediterranean and across a 2-week trip across the Atlantic in a terrible storm, I arrived in New York Harbor the day after Christmas. So it took me from the 3rd of October until the day after Christmas to get back in the United States. Of course, I finally arrived in Salt Lake City on New Year's Eve, and it was exactly 12 o'clock when I got here, because as I got off the train I could hear the whistles and everything blowing for New Year's Eve. And we had the next day off, believe it or not, and I got reacquainted with my wife.
We appreciate your story. You lost a lot of friends and buddies out there. What perspective does this all give you?
Well, I made the minimum of flights across the hump. In other words, although I was a non-com and known as a shop chief and an assistant line chief, I never got enough flying on the hump to come home. But some of those hot pilots, they would make 2 and 3 trips a day across the hump. and they were sent back home as soon as they got 650 flying hours. But I never got that many, so I had to wait until the war was all over to get home. But I'm still pretty proud of the effort that we put in at the CBI theater.
Without your help, they wouldn't have been able to bomb Japan months and months earlier until they got the Pacific War going.
Right.
And you tied up 1.5 million Japanese in the jungles and
Right.
deserts of China so that they couldn't go out and fight the Pacific Fleet forces.
Yeah.
It's pretty substantial, I'd say.
Well, the Japanese had another problem too. They extended their supply lines too far. And some of those soldiers that we saw after the war had practically starved to death, the Japanese soldiers. But all in all, I've always been happy that I was sent to the CBI theater, because it was surely different than the other theaters.
Well, freedom isn't free. Never has been. I think all those people that served in World War II are heroes, and I can see why they call them the latest generation. Thank you.
Thank you. The patch for the 20th Air Force, the B-29 Air Force. Now, this one over here is the World War II Victory Medal. This one here is the European North African Theater Campaign here. This one here is the American Theater Campaign. Of course, included in the American theater was the Aleutian Islands. Remember when we had to fight for those. And then the other one is the Asiatic Pacific Campaign ribbon. This large one in the center was presented to us after the war. Chiang Kai-shek wanted to give us these, and General Chennault would not allow it. But after the war was over, then we got letters from China asking us if we'd like this medal. And I don't know what the name of it is. I heard that it might be the White Cloud medal. Now, this is my crew chief wings here. And over here, this little blue badge, that's the presidential citation there. And down here are crew chief wings presented by China to me, and I have a nice letter from the commanding general of the Chinese Air Force when he brought it. So, and then these red ones are good conduct medals. And for some reason I got two of them, so I used them both to balance up the display.